Hey everybody, welcome back to another video on this channel. And oh my god, Vue is 10 years old by now. Lots of things happened. The Options API has been around, well, since the beginning. And even the Composition API is 4 years old by now. So well, now the inevitable discussion comes up once again. What is the future? How about the Options API? Will it still be there? Should it be gone? Let's discuss this and when to use each API, or what you like and dislike about that, plus some common myths in this video. Here we go, Options API versus Composition API. Alright, I know it's a very polarizing topic in general, but it is an important one because Vue has two APIs, both are usable. You can choose whatever you want, you can even mix them, though that's not always recommended. And even when I give Vue workshops to people, teaching them Vue from scratch with just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript knowledge, I usually teach them both API, the Options API and the Composition API. Why is that? Well, because there are tons of resources out there that are still written in the Options API because they might be a bit older, but still good. On the other hand, there are also lots of good guides and tutorials out there in the Composition API. Plus, whatever you have in your job, like maybe a greenfield project or some legacy software, you might use either or both for example, migration. So there is no real way around that, at the moment at least. And that brings up a big and important question that also came up this week on Twitter, Reddit, and so on, so a bit of in the Vue community. The question of, once again, will the Options API go away? Yes, it's been a question asked quite some time, especially because there's still lots of legacy projects in Vue 2 sometimes even in the Options API, and the big question is, will the Options API go away? The whole topic came up once again because of a proposal from FoamKit author Justin Schrader, who writes on Twitter. Vue 4.0 proposal. No feature additions, but it makes the Options API disabled and marked deprecated. Can still be enabled via a shame flag moving forward. Standardization for the win. And on Twitter, quite some people agreed, also like some bigger people in the community, of course. But there was also quite some backlash of people saying like, hey, why disabling? It's my favorite API. I don't get it. So, of course, that's an important part of discussion here. Very important note, as mentioned, Justin Schrader is the author of FormKit, but he's not part of the Vue core team. So this was a suggestion, not like, hey, that will happen. That's the new thing for Vue 4. So it's very important to distinguish here between a suggestion, actually things that will happen, or like, hey, that's set in stone. So don't worry about that. We will see if the Options API go anywhere or not. But let's dig deeper in that proposal because, well, he even doubled down on that and wrote another tweet about his proposal and explained why he preferred that. And the main reasons were basically that multiple ways of doing things, well, they split up the community. I mean, we've seen it maybe also in the time ago with the Reactivity transform, which is also one of the reasons why it got removed again, right? So that's one point, and that kind of makes sense. The other two are, first of all, that the Options API is overhead in terms of that you can just use the same thing in the Composition API. We'll come to that in a bit. And of course, the third part of compilers, optimizations that like, okay, without the Options API, you can maybe even make things more performant with the compiler. And also that Vapor mode only works then with the Composition API is another point there. So it seems like there are some good reasons to maybe remove the Options API. But let's check what the Vue docs say on that. In the Composition API FAQ of the Vue docs, the official Vue docs at the time of recording, it says, will Options API be deprecated? And the answer is no, we do not have any plan to do so. Options API is an integral part of Vue and the reason many developers love it. That's also what we've seen in social media as well. We also realized that many of the benefits of Composition API only manifest in larger scale projects, and Options API remains a solid choice for many low to medium complexity scenarios. So what does it mean? Well, TLDR, no, the Options API will not like magically go away. Don't worry, it won't vanish overnight. Everybody who prefers the Option API, you keep it. Don't worry about it. Evan also mentioned that on Twitter once again, reacting to one of the tweets where I tried to do a little survey of people like, hey, why you like the Options API more than Composition API that's shown here, and it's basically reaffirming that. So that's very important. Double down, no, the Options API will not go away. But at the same time, Evan mentioned that it would be good in the future to be a bit more opinionated about how new projects start with in terms to what API to use. But very important here, that doesn't mean taking away the options API or anything. It's more of a educational and documentation change than saying, oh yeah, options API is gone. But we'll come to that part in the video at the end, where it really comes down to my opinion, and then I want to hear yours. But first, let's talk about why exactly prefer people the options API, or better, why not using the composition API. As mentioned before, I did a little tiny survey of a fracture of the Vue community, but still everybody had the chance to weigh in on social media, on Reddit, on Twitter. And I asked, okay, folks, why exactly you don't use the composition API? What's bothering you with that? And the answers were pretty astonishing. I can't go, of course, through every of the 100 comments, so I distilled them together into a few main points, and we'll go through them right away. And the first one is legacy. But some people were saying, okay, we still have like 30,000 lines of code of options API, and we have a bunch of components still in there. So of course, that's totally a valid point to say, look, we don't want to rewrite these components from the options API into composition API. And to be fair, nobody ever asked that, right? Nobody said, hey, you will never be able to use that. Even Justin's proposal said, let's just disable it behind a flag, you can use it, but it will be easier for people to just opt into the composition API because it's the default. Nevertheless, it's very important to note, and someone commented there as well, that rewriting a component from composition API to options API does not bring any additional value to the customer, to the user of the application. And I think that's a very good point there. Like, why rewriting something to get rid of tag debt if it doesn't bring a single benefit? Now, in terms of what libraries you use, what components you have, that isn't necessarily correct, but in general, I see the point. It's also very important to make a difference here between saying, oh, I don't want to upgrade from Vue 2 to Vue 3 or from Nuxt 2 to Nuxt 3. Instead, the whole point is really of saying, okay, I can use the options API even in Vue 3 and Nuxt 3. Nothing will break. So why changing it before like migrating with a big bang or whatever? Instead of saying, okay, I don't want to upgrade to that framework, because framework upgrades, well, they bring benefits like better performance and also opting into new dependencies, new libraries you can use. So the legacy part, I totally agree, but nobody stops you to say, hey, if I write new components or if I touch a component, then I can migrate it over to the composition API, depending on how much time you have in the end, right? So there you can use the script setup and composition API. Even in Vue 2, you can use the composition API. Without script setup, but even for that, there is an unplugin for that. Link, of course, in the show notes or in the description in this case. And don't forget that, yeah, you can also mix the APIs. If you migrate, you can have a setup function and then your options API part, but that's only recommended if you have an existing options API code base. And then let's start with the next point, the part of compatibility. And I briefly mentioned it already. Yeah, some people say, oh yeah, I'm still on Vue 2, composition API, no. The good thing is, composition API was backported to Vue with Vue 2.7. As I just mentioned, the only downside is you can't use script setup, but there's an unplugin for that allows to do that compile time magic if you want it. But otherwise, it's totally fine to say, hey, use a setup function. Maybe at one point I might migrate to Vue 3 and then change it to script setup and it will be all fine. So you could do that, but you can also say, I stick with the composition API, or say like, hey, why migrating, as just mentioned before. But that's an important myth that I wanted to be busted here for sure. The third point that came up quite a bit is the whole reactivity part, right? The dot value and explicit reactivity. So in the options API, everything was and still is reactive by default, which is great because you don't have to bother with like, okay, what is reactive, what is not reactive, everything is. Until we run into an issue where you say, hey, I want something that shouldn't be reactive. So we start with like object.freeze or workarounds or put that on the same level as the options. There were quite some with the options API that I also used. So it's not super ideal, especially with more complexity. But otherwise it's great. You don't have to bother about as everything is reactive. Now, the pros of the composition API there are that it is more explicit. You can say, okay, hey, this is reactive. This is just a plain JavaScript variable and all is good. So yeah, okay, it is more explicit, which also means you have to understand things like how ref works. You have to add a dot value if you use refs, which in my opinion is a pro because you see what is reactive and what not. So you can actually make this distinguishing there. But I understand people saying, okay, we had it all reactive before. Why having all that overhead? Nevertheless, there is a workaround to the composition API you can use. You can just say, hey, I use a big reactive, so no ref, just a big reactive for everything. And I treat it as my data in the options API, and it will just work the similar way. As mentioned, you lose the benefit of passing explicit reactive references around versus the value, but that's similar to options API where you also can't do that. So if you decide in the code base to go all that way, I think that's totally fine. There, just keep it consistent, of course. That's a very important part here. And the second to last argument I've seen very often is like, oh yeah, if I want React, then I can just go to React. Why not straight away write React then? And oh boy, that's a common misconception, of course, because composition API is not just like React hooks and Vue. Actually, yes, the options API is part of Vue's identity in a way. It started with it, it's still there, but honestly, even without the options API, just with the composition API, Vue is still rather unique to compare to all the frameworks out there. I mean, we still have baked in signals, right? We have ref and shallow ref. We have the composition API with deeply nested reactivity with the reactivity system and an amazing developer experience, plus also soon the Vapor mode, which will come as well. So it's not like we would just write React straight away when you switch to composition API. It's more like, yes, you have a bit of a different structure. And I think also that's what people are aiming for. More like, okay, it's not that easy anymore. I don't have everything straight away given by the framework where I should put my stuff. But that's the biggest part to discuss, and that we'll do right now. Yes, a common argument is the options API gives us a structure, the composition API is a mess, it's unstructured, it's not tidy, and so on, so on, so on. And let me start with this. When I learned Vue 2 back in the days with the options API, things were very easy. I wrote my component, I was wondering, okay, where to put things. It's, yeah, my state goes in data, that's fine. Computed property, I put it under computed, it's easy. A watcher, just watch, object, there we go. Functions and methods in the methods object inside my component. So it's pretty straightforward. And honestly, I understand that this will help getting started with Vue pretty easily. As I said before, it's still how I teach Vue usually because it's easy to get started into. And if you like more of a junior dev, that's also very appealing because you don't have to have all the knowledge of like architecture and structuring and so on and so on. So it's definitely a good thing. But the problem arises, and that's also what the docs say, right? When you have not only a small application, but like a mid to large scale application, because then your components, they grow and grow. And if you've ever seen like a components with, let's say, a couple hundred lines of actual script tag, right? Ignore the template in this case. And you want to find a certain feature or like a certain functionality, because ideally, of course, components only have one, but that doesn't always work. Then, of course, you have to jump through the whole file to understand the functionality. You have to check your state and data, your computed, your methods, your watchers. And in a way, you also have to check everything because you don't know, is there any other code that is related to that change or that logic? Because, well, you don't know. It's not grouped together by logic, it's grouped by type. That's what the options API does for you. And that means you either have to know the code very well, you have to read through all of that, you have to remember as well. So it's an increased cognitive load if you search for a feature. And commonly when we debug stuff, it's not like, oh, where is this computed? It's more like, okay, I have maybe some state, what's happening with that state? And then you have to jump through all these hoops and go through the whole file commonly. And that's great benefit of the composition API because you don't have to do that. But now people come like, yeah, but look, the structure, and I know, I understand that. But first, let's have a look at the separation of concerns, because this is always a great chart to have a look at. The original graphic I'll show here comes from Corey House, and he basically says that goes all the way back to frameworks in general. So like, okay, we can write a JavaScript in one part, or CSS in one part, or HTML in one part. Or why don't we have a component that has all three? Because a button, for example, is part of JavaScript, CSS, and HTML the same way. And I thought, hey, why not use that analogy? Because it really resonated with me, and apply the same to the options API and the composition API. So let's have a look. Separation of concerns for the options API is pretty much state and watchers, computed, methods, and lifecycle hooks, and they're all mapped in one thing, right? State and data, watchers and watch, computed, and so on. You get the gist. But if we switch to composition API, we have a little different structure. Now we have composables in a way, right? So we have like use something, and it might have some state, it might have some watchers, some computed, and so on. So it's all in there. Or like use another thing, use mouse, use something else, and so on and so on. So if we really compare that, we have A kind of similar idea. Either we group by type, as in like all stay together in data, or we group by logic, by saying, okay, here's my feature, like use, I don't know, message, use mouse, use visible. And in there we have all the logic. So the good part there is now with the composition API, you can group, luckily, by logic and not by type anymore. It makes it way easier to find all the code that really is related together. But the problem is you have to do that, right? You shouldn't just write a comment saying, I don't know, data, and then just write your refs or like your big reactive. Or you shouldn't write like methods and then put all your functions in there, because you then write, well, options API and composition API. If you prefer that way, you can do it. I would just not recommend it, mainly because it will be really tough to read at some point, understanding what the code does. Because once again, you don't search for, hey, where is that part of the watcher? You maybe more like, what is this certain feature doing and how to debug it? So you rather search by the logical unit than saying, I need this certain computer property, in my experience at least. But yours might differ. I'm curious, if you have a different experience, please drop it down in the comments below. And I also talked about this plus refactoring a whole like options API part to composition API in my other video called Organizing Code and Composition API. The link is in the description and up there somewhere, you know. And there are also other approaches instead of inline composables, so having, well, functions as in JavaScript and TypeScript called composables, not in an extra file, but just in a component that export methods you want to use, export refs, reactives, and so on. So you can actually group them. As I mentioned in the other video, it's shown very nicely. And yeah, there are other options as well, other approaches, for example, creating extra script blocks for co-locating UI-specific things people suggested, and separating things in a different way. In my opinion, inline composables work pretty great, and composables that you reuse multiple times and extract, but feel free to try it other ways too. I'm more than sure there's merit in them as well. And the good thing is, things and structures like these inline composables or even extra script blocks, they reduce the analysis paralysis a little bit. The whole like, okay, composition API has no structure anymore. It doesn't give me this like boilerplate, let's say. I don't really know where to put things, so I just put them as I feel. And sometimes this feeling is not as good as it could be because you're not used to it. So I think with a bit more either reviewing and structure, but you can't always think that in a big team, let's say, right? If you have like hundreds of devs, that doesn't necessarily always work. I think it would be great to have a bit more input from the ecosystem. I don't even mean like the Vue team in general, just saying like, okay, people share what works, share your approaches, share your patterns. And maybe that even works out to get into documentation as like a little cookbook or recipe. So I think everyone saying like, oh yeah, we use composition API, it's great. Here are some patterns that we use to keep code structured. Please share them. We would all appreciate that. Okay, well, now we have a bit of the downside of the structure and also the upsides with options and compositions API. There are, of course, some more benefits to the composition API that the options API doesn't have. And one of them is definitely the TypeScript support, because, oh my God, I was like, for a long time, I was really not into TypeScript at all. I was writing Vue 2 and it was difficult to use. Also back then, the class components, they didn't really feel the pattern that I want to use. So I tried them, wasn't really convinced of them. With the composition API, that's really smooth, plus it just works, right? It's less magic. There is no this where you say like, oh yeah, okay, sure. This maps to either a prop or a data computed. No, it's really explicit, which means it's also easier to follow when you get used to it. That's always an important part too. You have to get used to the composition API to actually embrace it and really like it. If you say like, no, that doesn't work like before, that won't work. But it's the same with all tech, I would say. And the other thing is, I just mentioned it, the boilerplate. We don't have that big part of a component. We can like really shrink it down and even abstract things very nicely away. And the code sharing, well, if you never used mixins, that's usually a good indication that your project isn't that big or that you just copy code everywhere, whatever floats your boat. But if you ever used mixins, especially multiple ones, it's a pain, because then you have this dot data or this dot my value and you don't know where it comes from. If it's not a component and you use multiple mixins, that's tricky. Plus, don't even get started with like mixins that share the same data together. You kind of tightly couple them without really explicitly saying that, because then they say like, okay, they all rely on, yeah, this dot data, for example, and it's not really clear. With composables, that's way easier. But once again, these are problems that you usually see when your application grows, not when you start straight away. And besides these technical benefits, there's also one other thing that comes, once again, the ecosystem. The ecosystem, because of course, things like Pina, the view router, they provide options and composition API support. But if you have a look around the ecosystem landscape and packages, not every package, even the popular ones, does fully support options API as well as it does with the composition API. Why? Because library authors don't have to support both APIs. Nobody forces them to. It's not mandatory. So I also understand open source is time consuming. I know it also myself. So it would be cool to support both APIs, but sometimes it's difficult to find the right abstraction just for one of them. And then it would be good to focus on what also the Vue docs recommend as the main API, which is the composition API. Because the Vue docs already say the following. For production use, you should either choose the options API if you don't have any build steps. So that's also an important part to mention. If you don't have that, if you have just a little bit of progressive enhancement on top, options API is totally fine, but then you commonly don't run into any of the issues just mentioned, right? So progressive enhancement, low complexity, that's your way to go. Go for it. But it will be more tricky if you actually build like a full application, a full front end in Vue.js, then, well, composition API and single file components are recommended for production use from the Vue docs themselves. And I also think that what most libraries authors adhere to as well, to first support the composition API after all, and then the options API, unless of course official integrations, because that would be a bit problematic if they wouldn't have both, right? So we discussed quite some of the downsides and upsides of both APIs, and now here comes the opinion block. My personal opinion after going through these things, and maybe about the opinionated start in the future. Because what I could imagine would be, okay, if the Vue.js docs would prefer the composition API, what they on paper already do, but like in a more in-your-face way, let's say, not hide the composition APIs and like that's not a thing, we don't have it, but just say, okay, we focus on the composition API, that would be a good step because more and more people would get used to the API, which is the future. Because once again, Vapor Mode, for example, only work with composition API. Lots of libraries, only composition API, and so on. Plus, the good thing is we don't have to take the options API away for that. As mentioned before, it's fine. Yeah, maybe at some point in the distant future, some kind of flag would be possible. So like, okay, we have that flag already to remove the options API, which is a compiler flag, right? It's just default to no, we don't. But you could maybe enable that, plus have a very graceful and easy way of detecting, oh, something is using the options API, you have to enable that again. So people are not like, my application doesn't work, what's wrong? Maybe even auto-analyzing and saying, oh yeah, you have some options API there. We flip it for you, give you a warning that it's on again, and this is this in that file. Something like that. So lots of automated help, but guiding users towards the composition API eventually. But don't remove the options API at all, or taking it away for the low complexity scenarios. And I think the biggest part is the whole part of tooling and guidance. As I mentioned before, especially for big teams, maybe we want some way to bridge the skill gap between the coding skills of the individuals. So composition API looks a bit more uniform and a bit more opinionated. And that starts with like, okay, how to not misuse composables. Like, for example, if use fetch and how people use it wrong. Very common thing in Nuxt, for example. How to deal with async composables. Should it be a thing? A multi-level async composables, and so on, so on. And yeah, even code mods maybe, even though I know, also Evan wrote that in a tweet, they experimented with it and it's tricky to find a one-fits-all solution, but maybe even an 80% solution could work out there. So I personally would love to see that. So it would be easier to get people to like, hey, okay, let's try the composition API without a big hurdle, make sure that there are some guides, some style guides as well, that make sure you don't get into any pitfalls. And yeah, that the code quality doesn't suffer if you don't know architecture and structuring that well. I mean, sure, it also does in JavaScript in a way, right? In plain JavaScript and TS, we also can write functions as we want, but ideally, our beloved framework can do a little hand-holding maybe. So that could be cool. And as I mentioned, more educational material, right? Videos, blogs, courses even, that are easily accessible, like ideally free, and people sharing their knowledge, right? To that, by the way, mentioned there's a Vue schooling. They have really cool free courses as well, so definitely check them out. Also a lot about the composition API, just mentioning that here. And now it's your turn, because, well, I think I already mentioned everything about it. We can give a little TLDR. No, options API won't go away. Yes, composition API is preferred on paper unless you have a very like low complexity scenario or small to, well, almost medium-sized application. But in the end, for learning, use whatever makes sense the most. Learn both APIs. From my side is also very important because understanding both gives you the advantage to read all the things out there. And yeah, I think the future will be bright and vivid. Now, as I said, it's your turn. Please let me know what's your favorite API and why. Did you try out the composition API if you liked the options API before? What do you think? Anyone convinced about inline composables? Please drop it in. Also, let me know what you think of Justin's proposal, what you think of my idea about a bit more opinionated things, and all the things mentioned. I will read and answer everything as usual. And other than that, please stay tuned, check out the latest videos, the linked videos, older stuff, and otherwise there will be another one next week. Plus, check out the Deja Vu episode this week. Very lovely. Michael and Matt are talking about how you can learn new Vue features and concepts. That's it from my side. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you do, as usual, please subscribe, follow, comment. See you next time. Happy hacking.